Hi guys, I'm Maylin Dovan, certified athletic therapist and founder of Rehab-U Movement and Performance Therapy, and I want to talk about building resilient shoulders. So I posted this a little while ago, and it was something that created a lot of interest. I talked about how the shoulder naturally impinges. So I was like, what if I tell you that shoulder impingement is just, that's what happens when you lift your arm overhead? And essentially that's what it is, because we talk about a subacromial space and subacromial impingement. There really isn't a subacromial space in the sense that there's no space. It's a subacromial area in which there are tendons and there's a bursa, and there's actually not really any empty space. And naturally, every time you lift your arm overhead, you're pinching those structures underneath the acromion. So where it becomes problematic is, like anything, if from one day to the next you go into a situation where you're doing a lot more overhead work, then the tissues there don't have the tolerance to bear that, right? So it's a little bit like people start, running is good for me, so I'm gonna start running. So they go from sedentary to I go running 3 days a week for 5 kilometers, and suddenly I have shin splints. So they've just exceeded the tissue tolerance because the tissue tolerance is not adapted to that kind of stress. So it's a little bit of the same thing with shoulder impingement. So anytime we go into some sort of sport where we're doing more overhead work, we get into a situation where we're increasing the number of times per day, the frequency at which we're going into that impinged position. And that can create irritability. That being said, even though it's a natural physiological thing for the shoulder to impinge, the fact that there isn't an actual space means that if you're gonna go into higher frequency overhead work, you wanna make sure that you have pristine shoulder mechanics, because then you decrease your chance of impingement becoming problematic, okay? So by pristine mechanics, I mean obviously good scapular movement for overhead work, so appropriate mobility and stability. That's always a first step. And a lot of people go into overhead work without having what I call the prerequisites for overhead movement, which I've discussed in previous capsules. So do you have the prerequisites? Can you get there? Do you have the mobility before you start hanging off stuff or throwing stuff up over your head? Okay, so those are the basics. But that being said, even though you have the basics, you could have all the mobility you want and all the stability you want. If you don't have strength, you have nothing. Okay, so mobility and stability is all nice, but in the end, strength is the most important thing. So how do you build resilient shoulders? For one, you want to have strength in those crucial positions. So if we're talking about overhead work becoming problematic, and we're doing our proper prehab work of making sure someone has the right mobility and stability to get into the overhead positions, our next step from there would be to say, am I strong in those positions? Because the stronger I am in those positions, the more resilient I will be. So how do I make sure that I have strength in those positions? Do some overhead carries, do overhead holds with considerable weight, do dead hangs or hanging from a bar, not in your passive structures, but hanging with a little bit of activation. So work that overhead position, work your strength in that overhead position, okay? Another thing I like to take into consideration is control and endurance, okay, of the scapular muscles. So a couple of drills that are interesting for building that control and building the endurance are a scap step down and some overhead shrugs. So we're gonna have Frank demonstrate the scap step down and overhead shrugs. So you're gonna start over here, Frank, and you're gonna have one hand on the step. So I'm gonna show him this as we go. And the other hand is gonna be even. And then what you're doing is just gently lowering that hand down to touch the ground and then push through this shoulder to bring it back up. There we go. And release and up. Now I'm gonna have him do this nice and slow. So 1, 2, 3, and then up in 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, up in 1, 2, 3. I'm gonna get him to do a few reps so you guys can see. He's got pretty strong shoulders, as you can imagine, but working through something like this is still challenging. 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 3, 1, 2, 3, just a light touch on the floor. Good. All right, so those are scap step downs. Another key position, obviously we're talking about the overhead position, so I'm gonna have Frank do some super slow overhead shrugs. So I'm gonna get you back facing the camera. Arms up overhead. Okay, and what I want you to do from here is I want you to just shrug up, 2, 3, and then lower down nice and slow, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, nice and slow, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Good. All right, so I'm working on control and endurance in those two positions. So just to recap, we want to have pristine shoulder mechanics if we're going to be working overhead a lot, because naturally overhead we impinge. If we impinge naturally and we do it too frequently, or if the mechanics are a little bit off, it's going to become irritable really fast. So first and foremost, do I have my prerequisites? Mobility, stability in the overhead position. Then I want to work on control and endurance. I can use either or both of these drills for control and endurance. And then next, I want to strengthen those key positions. So I want to do some carries, some holds, some hangs, okay, to get strong in that key position. And that's how you build resilient shoulders.